Hypersexuality and the normalization of sexual harassment and abuse in Jamaican culture. In Jamaica, sexual abuse or assault is so prevalent, whether against children or adults, and regardless of gender, little boys can be victimized almost as much as little girls, that it's almost come to be known as a horrendous rite of passage for most Jamaican children. UNICEF estimates that at least 120 million adolescent girls under the age of 20, or about 1 in 10, experience child sexual abuse worldwide. And in Jamaica, the Child Protection and Family Services Agency received 9,800 cases of abuse against children in 2020, with 20% of the cases involving sexual abuse. But the true number of victims is still difficult to know because, according to UNICEF's 2017 global report, only about 1% of adolescent girls experiencing sexual violence reach out for help. And for boys, the numbers are even lower because of stigma surrounding the sexual abuse of males. According to the None in 3 Research Center at the University of Technology, child sexual abuse has 2 categories: contact abuse, which involves touching, and non-contact abuse that can range from verbal harassment to forcing a child to look at pornographic pictures or films. None in 3's report also considers the effects of negative social and cultural attitudes and perceptions that normalize sexual abuse and increase its prevalence. It's unfortunate that entrenched in Jamaican society is a culture that promotes hypersexuality and the normalization of sexual harassment and abuse. In North America, this term would more popularly be known as rape culture, a phrase coined in the 1970s used to describe the ways in which society normalizes sexual violence. We have cultural values that uplift sensuality and sexual immorality. It's celebrated in the songs, the dances, the movies, and entertainment. We are bombarded by hypersexualized images of Black women degraded, scantily clad, and objectified in commercials, music videos, and magazines. The lyrics of dancehall and soca songs celebrate and encourage promiscuity and lewdness. And every year during the summer, we have the season of Carnival, where men and women parade themselves in the streets half naked, usually intoxicated, and dancing provocatively in full view of our children. And don't naively think that exposing children to sexually charged entertainment has no effect on them or flies over their heads. Another alarming trend is the growing incidence of child-on-child sexual abuse, which is where a prepubescent child is sexually abused by one or more other children or adolescents. The trauma for these victims can be just as damaging as if they had been abused by an adult. And according to a 1997 study, the perpetrating child tended to be exposed to pornography or repeatedly witnessed sexual activity of adults at a very young age. Our culture treats the act of sex and the sacredness of our bodies with nonchalance, casualty, and indifference. Coarse joking, corrupt conversation, and lewd talk is commonplace even within the Christian church. Altogether, it cultivates a dangerous environment where anyone, including young children, can be seen as a sexual object to be preyed on. And this has nothing but dire effects, both spiritually and psychologically. According to the study by Jamaica's University of Technology, the effects of sexual abuse can last a lifetime. Female survivors reported challenges with psychological functioning, interpersonal relationships, and academic performance. Victims can experience a range of distressing emotions, including suicidal thoughts, self-harming behaviors, and poor self-esteem. Male survivors in the study suffered from aggressive and out-of-control behaviors, hypersexuality, poor social interactions, poor academic outcomes, and substance abuse issues. To make matters worse, there are very few safe spaces, supports, and resources in Jamaica for male and female survivors of sexual abuse. For one thing, for many years, the government of Jamaica had no policy or legislation outlawing or prohibiting verbal sexual harassment, and only in 2021 introduced the Sexual Harassment Protection and Prevention Act. Even with its introduction, introduction, the Act still does not address the issue of intrafamilial or domestic sexual harassment that occurs within the home. And because of the policy's late introduction, it's been a long-held cultural belief that verbal sexual abuse is normal, unavoidable, or even should be viewed as a light or casual compliment. There is nothing light, casual, or normal about sexual abuse. The trauma from sexual abuse, whether physical or verbal, contact or non-contact, is a very real and lifelong challenge for survivors. But it is a common response and coping mechanism for most survivors, especially within a culture that normalizes abuse, to bury the memories and experiences and pretend it never happened, dissociate from it completely, or simply never address it while the psychological effects of their trauma continue to fester. This avoidance strategy is why high rates of sexual violence continue to persist in Jamaica, as some victims, especially male victims suffering with aggression and anger in response to their traumas, later turn into victimizers, perpetuating the cycle, and why the country is also facing a mental health crisis. First steps to healing: recognizing sexual abuse for what it is. Healing means acknowledging that the abuse done to you, whether physical or verbal, was wrong. The Lord has no tolerance for anyone who would sexually abuse another. It is not to be normalized or minimized. The reality of male victims. Healing also means recognizing the reality of male sexual abuse victims. While being a victim of child sexual abuse does not destine a person to grow up to be a perpetrator who victimizes others, the fact is a large number of male sexual predators have learned these predatory behaviors from childhood because of being exposed to inappropriate sexual material or activity or being preyed upon themselves. Let it be quite clear: exposing a child to any form of sexually explicit content, entertainment, or activity is a form of child sexual abuse. In Jamaica, there is also the false cultural perception or belief that boys or men cannot be real victims of sexual abuse because sex is always enjoyable for a male, whether or not they have given their consent, and especially if their perpetrator is a female. And for a man or boy who was victimized by a male, they face even more social stigma than women and girls because they are seen as weak or emasculated for allowing the assault to happen. Or they are even seen as automatically homosexual, even though being victimized has nothing to do with one's sexuality. To make matters worse, for a long period, Jamaica's Sexual Offences Act had such a narrow definition of rape, by assuming the victim was female and the offender was male, that it failed to protect male victims, and only in 2011 expanded the definition to consider possible male victims. Jamaican author and sexual abuse survivor O'Brien Dennis had interviewed several male victims for his book, The Cries of Men: Voices of Jamaican Men Who Have Been Raped and Sexually Abused, and in a Jamaicans.com article spoke on the hypermasculinity or toxic masculinity prevalent in the culture that keeps male victims silent. Quote, "Male sexual abuse in Jamaica is not on the decline. It is gradually increasing and grossly underreported. Jamaica's cultural values, which include religion, music, and our political framework, has been a major deterrent in forcing young boys and men to be silent about sexual abuse. Society has narrowly defined masculinity and expects its boys to be fearless, strong, always in control, and defenders. What abuse does is to steal your authentic self and bring you in a state of confusion, fear, anger, and denial." Recognizing some cultural myths. In Jamaica, there are unfortunately several false social and cultural perceptions and myths that facilitate and enable sexual abuse, and we'll examine a few of them here. Myth 1. Teaching a child or adult how to be good in bed. One of the first myths is that a child or adult, because this can happen at any age, needs to be taught sex through exposure to pornographic material, explicit or inappropriate conversations, or descriptions of sex acts, touching and fondling, or even full sexual intercourse, so that as adults they'll be good lovers. Again, there is only one context in which sexual activity of any kind is acceptable. It is between two consenting adults, who have chosen to give themselves to each other. When it is the appropriate time, biology will take over. There is no need for a practice run. If an adult married couple feel they are experiencing sexual dysfunction, then there are always professional resources and counseling that is available to them. Also, formal sex education in school, or a birds and the bees conversation with a parent that teaches the biology of the human reproductive system, birth control options, and the reality of STIs is perfectly appropriate. But outside of that context, there is no need for any minor or adult to be taught how to be a good lover by touching or test driving their private parts or exposing them to sexually explicit material or lewd conversation. This is sexual abuse hidden under the guise of pure motives. This behavior is predatory, and any person who does this is taking advantage of the imbalance of power between an adult and child, although there can be an imbalance of power between adults as well, or children close in age. And using this falsehood as an excuse to enact their own perversions, which they probably learned from being preyed upon themselves. This is how sexual abuse becomes cyclical in nature. Myth 2, if it felt good, it wasn't sexual abuse. Many victims of abuse don't realize they have been victimized or are confused about their abuse because the experience felt physically good. This can happen a lot for boys, but this can also happen with girls as well. The body is designed with autonomic functions that you cannot control, and that regardless of whether you have given your consent or not will still be triggered. For example, peristalsis, where your intestines move food and waste through the body, is autonomic. You have no control over it. Your heartbeat is autonomic. Certain brain and organ functions are autonomic, and likewise, the body's ability to become sexually aroused is autonomic when exposed to certain stimulus. A person may be confused because they felt a sense of guilt, shame, and violation from the experience, but they also experience feelings of arousal. There are also many predators who will also say they never abused their victims because they noted that the victim experienced physical arousal. Let this be clear, physical arousal is never an excuse to violate someone else's body. There is never an occasion when it is okay for someone else to violate the sanctity of your body. Even within a marriage, both partners require consent. If you have ever been coerced or pressured into engaging in sexual activity, whether by a man or a woman, by an adult, or even another child close in age, sexual abuse has occurred. And the trauma from that experience can be just as psychologically damaging as an act committed with physical force or violence. Myth 3, being a virgin is a bad thing. Unfortunately, we live in a culture that decries sexual purity and celebrates promiscuity and lewdness. Someone who is a virgin is undesirable, but having sex outside of marriage is cool or shows that you have prowess. Having multiple sexual partners before marriage increases your risk for an unwanted pregnancy and sexually transmitted disease, but it can also leave you feeling used and emotionally empty. Myth 4. A child who has a voluptuous body is now ready for sex or to be seen as a sexual object. In Jamaica, children are unfortunately sexualized from a very young age, particularly girls who may be overweight or have developed early physically. We live in such a morally corrupt nation that many adults don't see the perversity in viewing a 10, 11, 12, or 13-year-old in a sexual way.
I was 13 years old and I had these big old breasts, and I wasn't mentally prepared for the attention that came with it. I'm still a kid. I'm still loving the fact that I'm in Jamaica and I'm in nature, and then all of a sudden the attention when I will go down there changed. Like, men were just on me, to a point where I was in a situation where I could have gotten raped, But if it wasn't for my aunt.
As a result, child and adolescent pregnancy rates in Jamaica are much higher than the global average. Even though under the Sexual Offences Act, it is illegal for a child to engage in sexual activity before the age of 16. A child or minor may have a physically developed body, but children go through several stages of development before they are psychologically mature enough to engage in consensual sexual activity. Child development sets the foundation for lifelong learning behavior, physical and mental health. The experiences children have throughout childhood shape the brain, their capacity to learn, socialize with others, and regulate their emotions in response to stress. Unfortunately, there is a complete disregard for this development process that is happening in young and pubescent children. And the trauma of being sexually harassed or abused so young can completely stunt this necessary mental growth. The normalization of hypersexuality in Jamaican culture means children are being exposed to explicit and age-inappropriate music, entertainment, and conversation. It introduces toxic, abusive, and dysfunctional sexual behaviors, and quite frankly, grooms the child to be more easily victimized because, after all, sex is normal and no big deal. The effect of sexual abuse on a child is devastating, where children develop low self-esteem, where they view their bodies as only good for what they can be used for. It can cause them to question their sexuality, their identity, and according to a 2017 study published in the Industrial Psychiatry Journal, child sexual abuse is also significantly associated with a wide range of psychiatric disorders, ranging from depression, PTSD, and psychosis to substance abuse later in adulthood. Myth 5. Sexual harassment is really just a compliment. Many perpetrators who engage in verbal sexual harassment often excuse their behavior as being complimentary. But truthfully, an adult has no business in commenting on the sexual attractiveness of a minor. Unwanted sexual remarks towards someone, whether the victim is an adult or child, are still a violation of that individual's consent, regardless of whatever the perpetrator's intentions are. According to the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women, sexual harassment is any unwelcome sexual advance, request for a sexual favor, verbal or physical conduct or gesture of a sexual nature that can cause offense or humiliation to the person it's directed towards. Many policies towards sexual harassment look at the issue within a work environment. However, sexual harassment can happen anywhere, at work, on the street, in the home, and even amid friends or family members. Though most reports of sexual harassment tend to involve men as the perpetrators, women can also sexually harass a male or female victim, and these incidents should not be minimized or made light of. Verbal sexual harassment can be just as emotionally traumatizing as a physical act, but unfortunately, since in Jamaica sexual harassment is fairly commonplace, it has been normalized as something men or women or children should just deal with. Sexual harassment can include jokes, unwanted discussion of sexual topics, exposing oneself, unwanted physical contact such as a hug or a kiss, or making sexual comments about a person's body. These are just a few of the myths that have been entrenched in Jamaican culture and that enable sexual abuse and exploitation. But there are certainly many more dangerous and normalized societal beliefs and perceptions. But when we can identify these abusive behaviors and the social myths that enable them, it empowers us to be able to call them out for what they are and say no. Power dynamics of abuse. Sexual abuse tends to happen where there are asymmetrical power dynamics. The perpetrator has a more powerful or dominant position than the victim. Adult and child power imbalance. A power imbalance exists when one person has the ability, power, to influence the choices and actions of the other person. In the case of an adult and a child, the power dynamics are more obvious, especially if the adult is a family member. Children are, for the most part, absolutely helpless. They rely on parents or the adults in their lives for food, shelter, clothing, and other basic needs. And if their perpetrator is their main caregiver, such as a parent or another member of the household, there's nowhere to run. Another aspect that makes a child more prone prone to victimization is the unlikelihood that the child will be believed, especially if the adult abuser is well respected in their community or social circles. The accusations can easily be turned on the child that they are, for example, an ungrateful liar or with no appreciation for all the financial sacrifices that have been made for them. These power dynamics make it very difficult for a child to escape the circumstances or even disclose the abuse. What's worse is that in Jamaican culture, because little is understood about the power imbalance involved in sexual abuse and that it is not the child's fault, the child can easily be blamed and even physically punished for the fact that the abuse happened.
I was raped at the age of 9 by my stepfather. In that family, it was as if something went wrong, you're to be blamed for it.
Most of the time, my mother used to curse me and say, "You go have sex with man, give me this and me can't come in yard."
This is one of the many reasons many child sexual abuse victims can only confront their trauma as adults or when they have been able to put space between themselves and their adult abusers. A child can never be held responsible for the predatory and sexually inappropriate behaviors of an adult, even if they consent to or participate in the abuse. First off, a child or adolescent's cognitive abilities to even understand what they are consenting to is underdeveloped, which is why even Jamaica's Sexual Offences Act makes any sexual activity with a minor under the age of 16 years illegal. But even for minors 16 years and over, the adults in their lives have the moral and ethical responsibility and obligation of making decisions on the child's behalf for their care. Under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, parents or other adults responsible are given the primary responsibility of ensuring their child's proper health and development, which includes protection from abuse and exploitation. Adults are always in the superior position to the child, physically, psychologically, financially. Even if the adult perpetrator is a woman and the child is a male, the victim and perpetrator are the same sex, or whether they are a member of the same household, and especially when they are a member of the same household or not. Whatever the abuse, whether contact or non-contact, and whether you consented to it or not, know that it is not your fault and that it is the adults that have the moral burden to protect you. Child-on-child power imbalance. It unfortunately does occur where a child will sexually victimize another child. In this case, the perpetrating child may not always have the cognitive ability to know that what they are doing is wrong. Power imbalances can still exist, for example, if the child is slightly older or several years older, physically stronger or more cognitively mature to be able to coerce their victim. With child-on-child sexual abuse, the role of victim and victimizer can be of either sex, whether a boy victimizing a girl, which tends to be more common, a girl victimizing a boy, or same-sex victimization. Know, however, that child perpetrators are very likely to be victims of sexual abuse themselves, since studies have shown that children with inappropriate or abusive sexual behaviors have often been exposed to adult sexual activities, age-inappropriate entertainment, or pornographic material. However, the trauma can be just as devastating, and child-on-child sexual abuse should not be minimized or mistaken as not a valid form of abuse. Child-on-child sexual abuse survivors need as much support and resources as victims of adult perpetrators. Adult male-female power imbalance. A power imbalance can exist between men and women in several ways. Men tend to be larger and physically stronger than women. In the case of the relationship between intimate partners, that power imbalance can also be greater if one partner is more financially independent and the other is reliant on that person for financial security. There can also be a social power imbalance where the abuser is more well known in society, has a prestigious reputation, and enjoys recognize a level of social status among their peers, in their community or social circles. This can make it very difficult for a victim of abuse to be believed or find support, because people may be afraid of the consequences of going against an abuser who is well known in society or has a prestigious reputation by taking the side of or supporting the victim. This is not to say that it is impossible for a grown man to be sexually abused by a female perpetrator. Sexual harassment can go in either direction. However, with the way society is currently structured, and especially within a work environment or intimate partner relationship, it is more common for men to have the upper hand when it comes to a power imbalance and for women to be the victims. And with regard to finances, even though a 1984 study found that women in Jamaica are often the sole financial, social, and emotional providers for their families, a report by Amnesty International found that gender-based violence still affects women disproportionately when compared to men. The United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women also observed that discrimination and sexual violence against women has been fueled by toxic stereotypical beliefs and attitudes about women in Jamaica. These negative stereotypes and cultural beliefs make it hard for a woman's testimony to be believed in court or even to be taken seriously by local police, which can further add to the power imbalance already faced by women. Power dynamics can take several different forms. Though adult to child and male to female are two of the most well-known power dynamics when it comes to perpetrator-victim roles in sexual abuse, this shouldn't discount same-sex victimization either. At the core of abuse of any kind, physical, psychological, or sexual, is an imbalance of power which can happen in several different scenarios and can take many different forms. This needs to be stressed to break down the stigma surrounding male victims of sexual abuse, or any victim whose abuse may not have happened within a stereotypically known way. Power dynamics exist in the home, at work, school, or any other kind of scenario, and it doesn't make the abuse less valid or traumatic. What is consent and what is coercion? When it comes to issues surrounding sexual abuse, another core issue is consent versus coercion. Consent can be the key difference between an act of abuse and exploitation and two individuals engaging in intimacy. Consent is simply giving your permission, and that permission is given freely and voluntarily without the use of threats or physical force. Don't make socially accepted norms and beliefs about intimate partner relationships fool you. Consent is even needed in marriage. Jamaica's Sexual Offences Act recognizes the crime of marital rape, and consent is not just needed for sexual intercourse. It's needed for any intimate act, from a touch, kiss, or hug, to even sharing pictures, texting, or engaging in conversation. If you never gave your consent or you were never asked for your consent, this person has violated your boundaries and your body. Coercion. A lot of people may feel they were never sexually abused because they gave the other person their consent or they were not physically forced. However, if you gave your consent because you were threatened or intimidated, you did not consent to the act. You were instead coerced. Coercion happens if the person uses threats of any kind, whether threats of physical violence or some other abuse of power or means of intimidation to get their victim to cooperate. Coercion happens a lot where there is a power imbalance, and the perpetrator can use their power as leverage over their victim. That power could be physical, financial, social, or even psychological. A parent, for example, can have a lot of psychological power over a child, saying, for instance, that if the child does not allow the abuse or keep it secret, they don't really love them, or they are ungrateful if they tell. One form of psychological coercion is the use of blackmail, where the threat could mean the perpetrator discloses damaging information. In the very famous North American case of Amanda Todd in 2012, a Canadian teen who was a victim of cyberbullying, her abuser threatened to widely publish nude pictures of the 15-year-old. Outside of coercion, here are some other circumstances in which you cannot give your consent. If you're intoxicated, if you're unconscious, if you're under the influence of a mind-altering drug, if you're under the age of consent. What is grooming? A very important term to know when it comes to sexual abuse is grooming. Grooming is a method a perpetrator may use to break down their victim's psychological defenses or boundaries so that they may more easily accept the sexual abuse or even not recognize when it's happening. When it comes to an adult abusing a child, the adult grooms the child by establishing a relationship with them if they don't have one already, building an emotional connection and trust so that the child will more easily allow the abuse. The abuser might give the child money, gifts, or even just their undivided attention, which children tend to yearn for. The abuser may build a relationship with the child's parents or family, gaining their trust and even more access to their child victim. Grooming can happen slowly and over time, where the perpetrator can gradually introduce sexual suggestions and ideas, testing the waters of the child's boundaries and their acceptance of the perpetrator's behaviors. This can even include viewing mildly sexual entertainment with the child, which can then increase over time. The abuser can also condition their victim by using casual or innocent touch, like a hug, which then gradually over time increases in how much and where these touches occur. Wade Robson, one of the main subjects of the HBO documentary film Leaving Neverland, described the gradual grooming he experienced as a child when left with his pop idol Michael Jackson, who he claimed sexually abused him since the age of 7.
First day at Neverland was Michael making physical contact with me, like his hand on my thigh, hugs, you know. It felt great. Within the context of what was going on, it seemed normal. This contrast began between the day and the night.
Another psychological technique that can be used by an abuser is convincing the victim that they wanted it or it was their idea. Robson later said in an interview with The Guardian, "He made me feel complicit, that I wanted it at least as much, if not more than him. But what does that mean? That I liked it? Like I'm a freak too?" The Saskatoon Sexual Assault and Information Center divides grooming into 6 stages. 1. Targeting the victim. The offender targets a victim by sizing up a child's vulnerability, emotional neediness, isolation, and low self-confidence. 2. Gaining the victim's trust. Here the offender watches and gathers information about the child, getting to know his or her needs and how to fill them. Quote, "They generate warmth and genuine concern for the child, while also gaining the trust of the parents." 3. Filling a need. The adult could be providing the child with special attention that only they can give, such as coaching, mentoring, gifts, extra attention, time. 4. Isolating the child. Perpetrators, quote, "create situations in which they are alone together. This isolation further reinforces a special connection and allows them to avoid oversight and scrutiny from others." Babysitting, tutoring, coaching, and special trips all enable this type of isolation. 5. Sexualizing the relationship. Once the perpetrator has established sufficient trust, the offender progressively sexualizes the relationship. Desensitization occurs very slowly and is often portrayed as innocent encounters, accidentally walking in on the child or having the child walk in on them when one is naked or in a stage of undress, or creating situations like going swimming in which both offender and victim are less clothed. 6. Maintaining control. Offenders commonly use the child's affection, secrecy, blame, and threat to maintain the child's continued participation and silence. Mass cultural grooming. It's important to note that a key element in grooming children for sexual abuse is desensitization. In Jamaica, there is a blatant disregard for shielding children from sexually inappropriate entertainment. Dance hall songs with lewd and explicit lyrics blare from the radios of the minibuses and taxis school children have to use for transport to and from school. Carnival participants, scantily clad, dance provocatively in the streets in broad daylight and in full view of children of all ages. This normalization of sexual behavior, and where the topic of sex is casually joked about, creates a desensitization which primes our young children for victimization by strangers, friends, family, or acquaintances. This early and constant exposure to sexual content can also create in the victim's mind an unawareness that they are even being abused because, after all, isn't sex just a normal part of life? To spurn or shrink away from sexual advances is seen as prudish and immature, making the victim even less likely to report the abuse or say no to their abuser. Grooming is not just for children. Grooming does not just happen when a perpetrator is an adult preying on a child. According to Anne Craft Trust, a leading UK authority on safeguarding adults and young people at risk, anyone who is in a position of power and trust can abuse and victimize someone else, including an adult in a more vulnerable position. Online grooming and sexual abuse. Sexual abuse and victim grooming doesn't just happen in person anymore. The internet and social media, especially since COVID-19, has revolutionized the way we interact and connect to each other. Now, abuse can happen in online and virtual spaces that make it easier for a perpetrator to hide their age, gender, and identity. Social media accounts can be completely anonymous, use fake photos to impersonate a celebrity or public figure, and such as in the case of the Canadian teen Amanda Todd, the perpetrator can inveigle or blackmail their victim to send explicit photos or videos of themselves. Now, most social media platforms and applications offer report and blocking tools, but the children of today are definitely living in a more complex and dangerous cyber world. Sexual abuse in religious settings. In Jamaica, we also have a disturbing trend of pastors and church leaders sexually abusing minors. Internationally, the Catholic Church has been no stranger to sexual abuse scandals involving minors, but any denomination can be vulnerable to this type of corruption. According to a Gleaner article published in June 7, 2021, in the last 7 years, a number of young Jamaican women have accused pastors throughout the island of sexual abuse, with one of the youngest cases being a 12-year-old whose abuser was charged in 2017. This is one of the reasons the church particularly needs to take an objective stance against sexual abuse, calling it out, educating people on what it is, and protecting its members, especially its most vulnerable members, children. Many church denominations across Canada and the United States have adopted a safe church policy or charter that equips congregations in sexual abuse awareness, prevention, and response. Church staff, leadership, and volunteer teams receive training through workshops and webinars in preventative measures and also how to respond when there is an incident of abuse. Allegations of sexual abuse need to be taken seriously and not just minimized or seen as a minor offense or an unavoidable evil. Anyone can be a victim of sexual abuse, and victims need to feel heard, believed, and supported, not silenced and simply told to get over it. Sexual abuse of any kind, including verbal sexual harassment, can have devastating, lifelong psychological effects such as mood disorders and post-traumatic stress disorder that can lead to self-harming behaviors such as substance abuse, eating disorders, and other forms of addiction. It can be a long psychological and spiritual road to recovery for survivors of sexual abuse. Acknowledging the emotions from trauma. For many people, especially if the sexual abuse happened in childhood, the realization of what actually happened and how you were victimized may only happen years later in adulthood. This is a common response because in order to cope and survive, the mind has a way of compartmentalizing trauma and its associated emotions until the person is ready or in a safe enough environment to confront them. When this happens, a person can feel a wide variety of emotions, from anger at the abuser to shock, horror, and even confusion, especially if the perpetrator was a close family member like a parent or sibling. Questions like why would they do this or how could they do this might come up. There might even be anger towards persons you disclosed the abuse to because you weren't believed or you were silenced. If the perpetrator was someone you love dearly and have a close relationship with, there can be many mixed feelings. It is very important for survivors of trauma to be in a safe environment where you can acknowledge and be allowed to feel these different emotions and talk about them. For people who are still living with the family members or intimate partners who abuse them, or you are living with household members who don't recognize or refuse to recognize abusive behaviors, this is not a safe environment for confronting and acknowledging your abuse. And unfortunately, in Jamaican culture, which minimizes and normalizes sexual abuse, and even within the church, has a very low bar for what should be considered immoral or abusive behavior, usually limiting it to only a violent rape, it can be very hard for survivors to find this safe space. There's also little education in the country about what sexual abuse even is, so it can be hard to find anyone supportive to confide in. Luckily, thanks to COVID-19, there are survivor support groups in North America that have moved to online virtual platforms like Zoom, making them now accessible from anywhere in the world. Breaking the silence around sexual abuse. It is ironic that within Jamaican culture and communities, we have high rates of incidents like child and intrafamilial sexual abuse, but yet there is still a code of silence when it comes to exposing and talking about it. These abuses are spoken about in hushed tones and whispers, and there is much fear and stigma surrounding the subject. Victims are intimidated into silence, called liars and troublemakers, or are stigmatized and seen as betraying their family or community. And in the meantime, abusers enjoy the unwritten rules and secrecy that help to facilitate their vices. But these are issues that need to be talked about. These are abuses that have to be exposed. It is within a code of silence that issues like sexual abuse tend to thrive. Most communities feel that if an issue is not spoken about, then the problem will go away on its own. However, the opposite is usually what is achieved. The stigma and silence that surrounds sexual abuse, particularly child and intrafamilial sexual abuse, actually enables perpetrators. It makes it easier for abusers to victimize their targets because victims have nowhere to turn and no one to confide in. Most people are more afraid of the consequences of exposing the perpetrator and the upheaval it will cause the community than the consequences faced by the victims. In an April 2022 Jamaica Observer article, gender and development practitioner Judith Wedderburn stated that a culture of silence doesn't just exist in Kingston's impoverished garrisons ruled by drug dons who prey on young girls, but even addressed the issue happening within the church. Quote, "Not all churches, but some. The male power is even further glorified if the man in question is a pastor. You're not going to embarrass pastor. You're going to keep your mouth shut. It's never mind if the girl child has been raped." For me, that is the most painful part of the culture of silence. This culture of silence works because it stands on a number of pillars. The church is one. Violence is one, poverty is one. The persons who break the silence, where do they go? What refuge do they find? The government could work hand in hand with some of the NGOs because it requires not just government. The NGOs could identify alternatives. Of course, intrafamilial abuse, that is, sexual abuse that occurs within the family, is even more shocking. And for most persons who discover that abuse has been perpetrated by a family member, there are intense feelings of horror, rage, confusion, denial, disbelief, and guilt. So much so that persons would rather believe it didn't happen. Even the victims themselves would rather live in disbelief. Coming to terms with sexual abuse from a close family member, such as a parent, can be very difficult. It's hard to wrap our minds around the idea that someone could be that sick. But intrafamilial sexual abuse is a very present reality for many adults who have survived it, and many children who are still in the midst of it. Turning a blind eye to its reality does a disservice to victims while liberating perpetrators to continue their perversion. explosions. Codes of silence don't just exist within Jamaican culture and communities. Sexual abuse and the secrecy that shrouds it exists the world over. But thankfully, since around 2017, the Me Too movement has created inroads to an international awareness of the issue of sexual abuse. Ever since the very public exposure of Hollywood executive Harvey Weinstein, who was implicated in a number of sexual abuse allegations, the widespread media coverage of the issue, along with the social media hashtag #MeToo, has placed the reality of sexual abuse and sexual harassment internationally in the public consciousness. It has also emboldened victims to speak out about their abuse and increase the number of resources they can reach out to. Exposing abuse or whistleblowing is necessary because it enables transparency and accountability, which can also lead to justice for victims. Ronan Farrow, the investigative journalist who exposed Weinstein's sexual indiscretions with various Hollywood actresses, said in an interview with Out magazine, "Uncovering the truth is the first and one of the most important steps towards holding powerful people accountable and protecting our basic rights. But change doesn't happen without people taking hard truths and translating them into social progress. The church has a responsibility to call out and expose injustice and corruption, and breaking the code of silence around sexual abuse is part of this mandate." you